Hello again, and welcome to our second segment of Moses Drawn Out by God. And the word Moses actually sounds like the Hebrew word drawn out because he was drawn out of the water as a baby. So the Egyptians said they called the Pharaoh's daughter called him Moses, which sounds like drawn out. And Moses was 80 years old when he began his ministry. Now, just think about that for a second. Most of us start a career at a young age, maybe in our 20s, some later, maybe 30s. Sometimes you'll see someone make a change in their 40s, go back to college or do whatever. Moses was 80 years old. Most of us would be in the nursing home by then. We'd be retired. The last thing we would be looking for is to go into the ministry and to serve people. We would be looking for someone to serve us. But see, God doesn't look at things the way we look at things, and He views people through different eyes. And so as we've been studying the last segment, we talked about the children of Israel were in bondage, they were in captivity. They'd been in Egypt now for over 400 years. They were slaves. They were making bricks, and they were building cities. They were building projects for the Egyptians. They were under severe bondage, and they had been crying out to God for deliverance. And God sent them Moses. And Moses, he was a great man. But when you look at his history, he wasn't perfect either. We'll talk about that at another time. So we talked about last segment that by the mighty hand of God, he was going to bring them out, that God would be receiving the glory for it. He also said, I revealed myself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but to you, Moses, I am Jehovah, and to your people, I am Jehovah. And if you study the names of God, you'll see that there are many names of God, and they begin with Jehovah. Maybe one day we'll do that. We'll study a little bit more in depth about that. But if you need peace, He is Jehovah Shalom. He's the God of peace. Whatever you need, He is that source. And so God reveals Himself as He sees fit. We judge other people and their relationship with God, whether or not they're like us or they're different, or they go to church and believe maybe they baptize a little different we do, and we're critical about that. But the bottom line is God reveals Himself to people as He sees fit. And in the case of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, He says, I am El Shaddai. And then 400 years later, Moses comes along and he says, well, Moses, to you, I'm Jehovah. So we look at verses 4 and 5. Now we're picking this up in Exodus, the 6th chapter, verses 4 and 5. And we see here that he says, I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan. Now he's talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where they lived as aliens. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I remembered my covenant. So God made a covenant with Abraham. And you can go back in Genesis, you can read it. Fascinating and important covenant. This covenant is the foundation of the Jewish religion, of their belief and their system. And it all stems back to that covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, as we refer to it, the Old Covenant. Let me leave a thought about that while we're on it, that God remembers His covenant, even if we forget or we don't even know about it. For example, these Israelites, 400 and some years later, they're in captivity, slaves to the Egyptians. And most of them probably were not really thinking about that, hey, we've got a covenant with God. Our forefather Abraham made this covenant. And he said, as long as your descendants will follow this covenant, the terms of this covenant, then, it'll apply to you and to them as well. So Moses comes along and he's reminding them, hey, did you know that Abraham made a covenant with Jehovah? And we're Abraham's descendants, and therefore that covenant applies to us as well. This was news to these people. They didn't know this. They were slaves. Their mentality was that we're just slaves. We are the lowliest of the lowliest. And, I might remind ourselves that we are too. We're slaves in our sin. And yet, Christ died for us, even when we were enslaved in our bondage. Jesus Christ went to the cross as the sacrificial Lamb of God on your behalf and my behalf. And boy, I tell you what, now we have even a better covenant than these folks had these thousands of years ago. But in verse 6 and 7, he says this. He says, therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you, and from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. So here's some thoughts. He said, I will free you. I will free you from slavery. I will redeem you. And redeem means to buy back. And I will take you. In other words, I'm not just going to leave you there, but I'm going to claim you as mine. I'm going to take you. Now, this has everything to do with the ancient Jewish custom that if someone was sold themselves, say, into slavery, maybe because of debts that they had, they couldn't afford to pay the debts, they sold themselves as an indentured servant or their children, then someone from the family, they called them a kinsman redeemer, would come or could come, and the nearest of kin could come and buy them back. In other words, pay the debt that was owed to the creditor and redeem them or buy them back and take them back into the family, restore them back into the family. Well, we see that God was talking to his people who were in bondage in the same manner and fashion. Doesn't that sound very much similar to the gospel? We were in bondage to sin. We were sold on the auction block of sin. We couldn't pay our debt. Our debt of sin was so great, we couldn't pay it. There was not enough currency to pay that debt. And yet God sent our kinsman redeemer to not only come and pay the debt, but in this case, he went a step further. He says, I'll take your place. I'll swap places with you. Well, we see that later on in the Gospels where Jesus did that. And then later, is after his resurrection, he said, now all authority has been given unto me in heaven and earth. He said, I've got the keys to death, hell, and the grave, and I'm giving you the authority. So in this case, he said, I'll free you, I'll redeem you, I will take you. Well, I'll tell you what, that's good news for any of us that have sinned and made mistakes in our lives. He said, I'm not ashamed of you. I'm not ashamed to be called your father. I'm not ashamed for you to be called my child. You know, a lot of us live with shame today. A lot of us have done things in our lives that we're ashamed of. And yet God says, you know what? I still will claim you. You're still mine. I am not ashamed that I would disown you. And then he says this. He says, I will be your God. Boy, I tell you what, that right there says it all when he says, I will be your God. There's not going to be other gods. There's not going to be idols. There's not going to be idols of a stone or precious metals or wood, because those are dead. They can't hear you. They can't do anything. I am the Lord. I am Jehovah. I am your God. You will be my people. Well, we have talked a lot today, and I better close this segment off, but we will come back again and we will talk more about Moses drawn out. God bless you.